Good morning, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our nutrition series. This is section 7, miscellaneous related subjects. Now in this section, I'd like to go into a little more depth with a few subjects that we've already mentioned within this series. The first one of those subjects is the concept of artificial and natural flavors within processed foods. Now, we've done a lot of discussion of the history of processed foods, the nature of processed foods, how the definition of processed foods is the gradual development of the science of removing enzymes from foods so that they last for a longer time on the shelves and thereby bring more profits. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the methods that have evolved during the past 100 years in that science of the processing of foods appearing on our supermarket shelves. Now this is a really fine resource, Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser. I think this book came out about 10 years ago, and it is a very valuable resource for going into some depth in understanding the nature of processed food that has evolved within the past several decades. Why is it that foods taste so good to us? We develop this need for our comfort foods, especially late in the evening when we're watching TV. We need our comfort foods in order to see that everything is right with the world. Why do these foods that are so intrinsically bad for us seem to have this very desirable flavor? And in Schlosser's book, we learn that this is no accident, but an extremely sophisticated and advanced science, the science of creating flavors within foods. And Schlosser describes his research into learning more about this group of biochemists who are located largely on the East Coast, actually in New Jersey, along a certain turnpike. There are a group of companies of studying and developing aromas and tastes in foods as their primary objective. You'll remember from school that the sense of taste is something that is confined to just a few basic areas. We have salty, sweet, bitter, and sour. Those are our four main tastes that the tongue is able to recognize. But when you look at the olfactory sense, our sense of smell, that is infinitely more refined. There are virtually thousands of aromas and scents and smells that our olfactory sense is able to recognize, to categorize, and more significantly, to remember. So this is why we always talk about, you can walk into a certain situation and some aroma strikes your olfactory sense, and suddenly you are transported back into your grandmother's kitchen 25 years ago. We've all experienced something like this. Well, this is the science that has developed with this group of biochemists that Eric Schlosser was studying, and these people are called Flavorists. That is their specialty, and you probably haven't heard much about them because that is part of their professional identity. They want to be kept in the background. They want to be sort of under the radar, let's say. So we learn that flavorists, they involve themselves with synthesizing, identifying, categorizing, and molecularly identifying thousands and thousands of chemical properties of various aromas and scents. That's scents, S-C-E-N-T-S, scents. As processed foods have developed into the enormous industry they are today, covering some 80% of foods on supermarket shelves, were it not for artificial and, quote, natural flavors being injected into the foods, most foods, processed foods, would taste generally like cardboard. They would have no taste at all, because as the enzymes were removed from the foods, largely the taste left as well. Now these flavorists have the task of disguising the blandness of these processed foods, and this has developed into the huge flavor industry that Eric Schlosser is telling us about in his book Fast Food Nation. So there's about a 10-page section beginning on page 122 of Eric's book, and I really recommend that you go through this book, and especially this section right here, and you may understand why we have this craving for our comfort foods that lasts for years and years. And maybe we had a certain food in childhood that we associate with a happier or more secure time of our lives. And now maybe as we get older, things are less certain and more stressful. But when we can taste these foods as we're relaxing in the evening, it calms us down and it brings us back to an earlier part of our lives. There's definitely a psychological component involved in the science of flavor. Aroma, it turns out, is 90% of flavor. Aroma, the olfactory sense, is 1,000 times more complicated. There are thousands of more aromas, more smells that the brain can catalog and remember over time than there are tastes. Thousands versus 4 or 5. Now we learned that as the flavorists have analyzed in very sophisticated ways the biochemistry of both tastes and smells deriving from food and from plants, they have systematized all this work into a very well categorized science. For example, when you smell fresh strawberries, did you realize that there are over 350 components to that one aroma? So this is the type of thing that the flavorists set out to study, to learn, and to categorize. And then as the different chemicals that make up these 350 components of one aroma, as each one of them is able to be synthesized and created, then these scientists are able to mix and blend and match, and also to create chemical additives that may be sprayed on processed foods that are very consistently used over long periods of time, over decades even, in order to give people this sense of comfort and reliability in these tasteless, bland, enzymeless, nutrient-deficient processed foods that have become our comfort foods. And we learned that these chemicals that they are able to identify and later to synthesize may be extremely concentrated. Eric Schlosser talks about some of them are so concentrated that they may be detectable by the human olfactory sense and our sense of taste in concentrations as small as parts per trillion. So to give you an example of this, it would mean that just a couple of drops of liquid, one of these synthetic chemicals that the flavorists have devised, just a couple drops of this liquid might be enough to flavor, let's say, 2 railroad tank cars full of liquid. Just a couple of drops could flavor that much liquid in a concentration that would be detectable by the human sense of taste and smell. So it's an amazing, astounding accomplishment that these scientists have achieved. And we talk about the psychological component of this science, the idea of memory, that we can remember, the brain can remember an aroma, an odor for decades and decades, and maybe you might not smell that particular aroma for many, many years, and suddenly you'll be in a new situation and it will hit you, and then you will recognize it right away, and it may transport you back to the exact place where you used to smell that smell. This type of thing, the psychological component, is very important to these people, to these flavorists. The idea of comfort foods, it's not something that's just random and we just choose it, but more we learn how it is made available and it is programmed to people, and this is what creates really a loyal group of customers who will buy certain snack foods, certain processed foods their whole lives. They develop a real love for certain comfort foods, and you know, we all have these foods. I'm sure, just think in your own life, foods that give you that sense of well-being. This is no random accident. It has been extremely well studied and extremely well documented. The science of artificial flavor, and Eric goes into great depth in these pages in Fast Food Nation, telling you the difference between artificial flavor and natural flavor. And he talks about how it's really unregulated, whether it's going to say on the label artificial flavors or natural flavors is really something that is unregulated, and he describes how a lot of times something that is actually an artificial flavor, in other words, the chemicals have been synthesized to make that flavor, the chemicals that were an exact copy of the components of the natural source, may actually be less healthy than what has been derived from a true 100% natural source, and vice versa. So it's really a very unregulated science, and the health and well-being of the consumer is not a consideration in this science. The health and well-being of the consumer is rarely, if ever, a consideration in this science. Eric describes how there are over 10,000 new processed foods created every year in this country. Can you imagine that? Over 10,000 new processed foods created every year. I just saw an ad, this was in the last few days here. There is a new food that has just come out on the market. It is Pepsi flavored pizza chips. Pepsi flavored pizza chips. Now, I haven't tried these yet. I'm really not looking forward to it, but I would imagine that eating these chips would taste exactly like a combination of Pepsi potato chips and pizza. But I really don't expect much health benefit or much food value from a food like that. But the chemical components of the taste of Pepsi, the combination of the taste and smell, for example, is something that can be analyzed and broken down into dozens and dozens of components, and then each one of these components can be chemically synthesized, and this is how, you know, they're not adding actual Pepsi, believe me, in the making of these pizza chips. But this is a very specific chemical process. Yes, and so I'm trying to give you some idea of how complex this science is and how well they can manipulate various components in creating new foods from the flavors of popular healthy foods that we have experienced as children. The combinations of new foods and new food flavors are virtually endless. It's an extremely sophisticated science. And at some point you get the idea that these people can make cardboard taste like the ambrosia of the gods. There's a concept that flavorists consider and is very important to this artificial food industry called mouthfeel. Now, I'm just describing this to give you an idea of the depth of sophistication in making of processed foods. How does that chip, how does that Cheeto, what is the feel of that as you chew it in your mouth? How fast does it dissolve and break down? How does it feel up against the inner part of the inside of the mouth, the roof of the mouth, the cheeks, the tongue, all of that? These are considerations that are studied and cataloged. And as we saw in the section on hydrogenated oils, how most soybeans produced in this country today are used for the creation of partially hydrogenated soybean oil, which is a component in the majority of processed foods, how there are hundreds and hundreds of grades of hydrogenated soybean oil that can be used for various purposes. Some can be added to chocolate candy to make it not melt in the sun. I mean, remember 20 years ago or more when chocolate candy bars would be displayed in a convenience store? If they were out in the sun, if sun could get to them, you would buy them and open up and they would be all melted. Well, that doesn't happen today. You know, candy bar displays in convenience stores can be in direct sunlight, and you can open them up and make sure that they're not melted. Things like this, the variations that are available to food scientists today. This is an example. The gradations in hydrogenated oils that can be employed for various purposes and objectives in creating processed foods. And one of these that we can describe is mouthfeel. How does the food break down? How long is it in the mouth during the chewing process before it breaks down and is swallowed? All these are important considerations in creating the memory of a comfort food that is going to create loyal customers for years, years, and years. Now, as I said, you've probably never heard of this group of scientists before, and they rather pride themselves on that, being below the radar. Eric describes how some of them are very proud of themselves that they can walk into a store, they can buy a processed food, and they can bite into that processed food, and they can recognize their own work or that of their colleagues. This is how sophisticated this industry and this field has become. Flavor industry is something that is really protected. The intellectual property and the secrets of these formulas of artificial and natural flavors that they have created is something that is not well regulated. On a label of a given processed food, for example, all that you will see on that label is perhaps artificial flavor or natural flavors added. And as I said, that short phrase might really be a combination of 200 or 300 different synthetic chemicals created in the laboratory by these scientists, the flavorists. So it's an amazing industry. It's an amazing field that has an enormous effect on our lives. I hope I've piqued your interest a little bit into the subject of the flavorist, the flavor industry, and please read the rest of that story in Eric Schlosser's book, Fast Food Nation, beginning on page 122. Very good. Now I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about a few myths that sort of irk me, I guess. And the first of these myths that I'd like to talk about for a minute here is the myth of gluten and gluten-free. I think I talked about that a little on one of the other sections. The reason allergies are so prevalent today and have skyrocketed so much in the past few years, they're saying, is due to gluten in whole grains and gluten in our foods. And if you can take a child off gluten, then suddenly all the damage from other processed foods, from the drugs he's taken, from the vaccines he's being given, from pasteurized dairy, all these symptoms and diseases are magically going to disappear because the real cause of those indispositions and diseases was really gluten. And this to me is something that is ridiculous at the same time as it is malevolent and insidious. So what is wheat gluten, for example? What is gluten? Gluten is the protein part of the grain. So the theory is if they remove the protein part of the grain, that is the reactive allergenic part, and then suddenly we can create gluten-free wheat byproducts that can then be used to make breads and cookies and cakes. And now you go into the supermarket and you see virtually an entire aisle loaded with gluten-free this, gluten-free that. I have a picture that I use. It's this ridiculous gluten-free layer cake, and it's loaded with hydrogenated oils, loaded with sugar, with all these frostings. It has virtually no food value, but because it's gluten-free, they sell it as a healthy food. So the idea here is don't be taken up by this gluten-free myth. Don't jump on this gluten-free bandwagon. The reason that breads, for example, are fattening and allergenic to children has nothing to do with whether or not it contains gluten. It has to do with whether it contains two ingredients that 95% of breads contain. And we talked about this before. What are they? High fructose corn syrup and partially hydrogenated oils. These are what makes a food reactive, because these are reactive non-food ingredients. These are also what makes these foods fattening, because it makes them indigestible. Hydrogenated oils cannot be readily broken down by the human digestive system, as we have seen. So the source of the gluten myth, I see it's very clear to me. I call it alternative light. It's kind of like medically trained, quote, nutritionists, or quote, nutritionists who are trained in the medical model. They will always be on this gluten bandwagon. It's almost as though they are trying to pretend that they have some knowledge of nutrition, and they're going to try to tell us what is going to make our children healthier and more disease-free, this whole story. But the fact remains, remember, the real authorities in this field are primary researchers, the first of whom was, of course, Weston A. Price. And we talk about all these isolated locales that he visited, researched, and spent months in cataloging their diets, their lifestyles. And you remember that the healthiest people on earth, they lived in isolated, sequestered areas, cut off from the rest of the world. But Weston A. Price recorded commonalities among these healthiest people on earth. And one of the most common features of virtually all their lifestyles was what? A reliance on whole grains locally grown. Whole grains locally grown. Gluten is not the issue. Whole grains are an extremely important source of our B vitamins. And whole grains, if they are grown in excellent soil, are also a good source of natural food-bound minerals. And look at these diets. Look at these diets that promote gluten-free, and you'll see these same people recommending allergenic foods like processed dairy, refined carbohydrates, and hydrogenated oils. And you tell me if these people recommending gluten-free diets know anything at all about nutrition. That's my question. Now, the second myth I'd like to talk about for a minute here is the myth of casein-free. The casein-free. And again, it's a parallel to the gluten myth. Casein is the primary protein in milk. So now we're going to pretend as though it's not the pasteurization of milk that has made it an allergenic substance in children. No, no, no. Now we're going to pretend like it is the casein, or the protein, which is really the nutritional value of milk. We are going to pretend like it is that component. We're going to pretend like it is that component that is detrimental to the child within milk. So now we're going to still pasteurize the milk, but we're going to then remove the proteinaceous portion of the milk, which is the casein, and then we are going to pretend like we have just solved the whole allergenicity problem in pasteurized dairy, and now it's going to be fine. This is complete mythology. It is junk science at its best. In the 6 states in this country where raw milk is legal to be sold, there has been a lot of legitimate scientific research conducted in the area of raw milk cures. Children are not reactive to raw milk and raw cheese. Pasteurized dairy, on the other hand, is the #1 cause of childhood allergy and childhood asthma. Virtually all holistic nutritionists agree on this fact. What irks me the most is when I see the few raw milk dairies chasing this market, and they will put out a product that will say casein-free raw cheese or casein-free raw dairy. And that to me is an ethical problem, because these people already know that raw milk is a complete natural food, able to be completely broken down and utilized by the human body. And they know that removing the casein damages it as a whole food and makes it less of a complete food, but they're willing to do that in order to chase the market. This is an ethical dilemma that I see, in my opinion. The third popular myth that I'd like to talk about a little bit is the myth of colloidal silver. Now, we've all seen colloidal silver advertised on the internet, and we've all seen colloidal silver being sold in health food stores. And what is it? It's supposedly a natural antibiotic. Yes, of course, heavy metals do destroy and do inhibit the growth of life forms, including human cells, including human life forms. Silver, like lead, aluminum, and mercury, is not a nutrient mineral. It is a heavy metal associated with no metabolic pathway. It does not belong in the human body. It is toxic. It is allergenic. In advanced cases, silver buildup in the body results in a skin condition known as argyria, and you can see pictures of that on many of the pathology sites online. So forget about colloidal silver as a natural antibiotic. It is not in the holistic model whatsoever. Now here's another area that I feel got skipped within this section. Back in the early 2000s, we had Tommy Thompson, who was head of HHS at that time. He was citing the William Klisch study, the famous William Klisch study. This is when Thompson was talking about the new phenomenon, which he was spending a lot of time on, which he realized was very critical in the coming years, the epidemic of type 2 diabetes within the United States. At that time, in the early 2000s, Thompson pointed out correctly that 5% of the American public was now type 2 diabetic. And he points to the William Klisch study that related obesity, diabetes, and cirrhosis of the liver. This William Klisch study documented this amazing statistic that 20% of obese children show signs of cirrhosis of the liver. 20% of obese children show signs of cirrhosis of the liver. Now I remember in Super Size Me, when they're talking about obesity and the pathological effects of obesity, they list a number of diseases and degenerative physical conditions that have been clinically associated and connected to obesity. And now here is another one, cirrhosis of the liver. The Klisch study also pointed this fact out. If diabetes occurs before age 15, this cuts off 17 to 27 years of life expectancy from the child. So that's something that we've seen in the past 20 years. It's been actually associated with the Haemophilus influenzae vaccine. I remember that from my book, Vaccination is Not Immunization. There is abundant scientific evidence to show that as more and more children were given the Haemophilus influenzae vaccine, now it spiked infant diabetes in this country. And now we're seeing infant diabetes and juvenile diabetes. Now remember, we're not talking about type 1 diabetes where there really is a defect in the pancreas. That's very rare. We're talking about type 2 diabetes, and as I always say, if you have type 2 diabetes, you did it. It's from your lifestyle, from the foods you have chosen has created this disease in you. But now, in the CLISH study, we learned that if diabetes occurs before the age of 15, statistically, you just shortened your life between 17 and 27 years. So we talked about this before in the last section. In the year 2000, 5% of the U.S. population was type 2 diabetic. By 2010, it was up to 10% of the U.S. population type 2 diabetic. This is documented on the CDC website. By 2011, it was up to 11.3% of the U.S. population is type 2 diabetic. The projections, which you can read today on the CDC site regarding diabetes, they make this statement that a child born after 2010 stands a 1 in 3 chance of becoming type 2 diabetic in his lifetime. So the projection of this statement is that by the year 2035, about a third of the U.S. population is expected to be type 2 diabetic. We are not only on schedule for that to happen, we are actually ahead of schedule. That will happen. Okay, I'd like to make a couple comments about obesity that I didn't have time to say before. The first thing is, forget this idea of 3 square meals a day, that you need 3 meals a day. Children today are eating constantly. In addition to the 3 meals a day, they're eating snack foods virtually constantly in between those 3 meals. If you don't feel hungry at a certain time, don't eat. If your child doesn't feel hungry at a certain time, don't force the child to eat. Now the reason, my opinion, is it's obvious that the reason children may not feel hungry at meal times is because all of the trash they have been eating for the past 3 hours before the meal time. How can you give the child pizza, fries, donuts, and potato chips and ice cream, all afternoon long, and then suddenly you've prepared dinner, you sit down at the dinner table, and then you expect him to be hungry for the presumably nutrient valuable foods that you've prepared for dinner? It's just not going to happen. So the solution to having children eat at mealtime is to cut out the trashy in-between meal snacks in favor of fruit snacks, dried fruit snacks. Even trail mix is better than the trash that most kids are eating. So if you're not hungry, don't eat. And this like compulsion to eat, or the oral fixation, the whole obesity consciousness. Yes, I realize that it's a psychological problem, a behavior modification problem. Yeah, all that's true. But these can be supported and these can be aided by what foods are purchased at the grocery store and what foods are actually brought into the house. I can't stress that enough. The other thing is we have to stop letting our children choose the foods. Hopefully, the parent is going to have a little bit more information, a little bit more understanding of what is trashy, allergenic, and fattening for the child than the child is. The child is driven by 2 things. The child is driven by TV advertising and by his desire for sweet and salty snack foods. Those are the 2 things that drives the child's appetites and taste for food. If the parent gives in to all this whining and all these demands and requests for foods, that means that you are allowing TV advertising to determine the declining health of your child, and that is exactly what we see all across this country today. So, as a parent, you're responsible for that child's physical well-being. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about collagen. This was the missing component of the 60-day program, and indeed it was the last of the supplements that I added to the list. My goal was always to keep the list of supplements in the 60-day program as short as possible, having as few items as possible so that the patient would be spending the least amount of money on supplements possible, but still having a complete nutrition and detox program. I think I've said that many times. But so many amazing results have occurred since we've added collagen as the 7th and final component on this list that I wanted to share some of those stories with you. Now, all these stories you can read on my feedback and testimonials section on the website, thedoctorwithin.com. Just click on, there's a little button at the top that says feedback and testimonials, and it's literally a couple hundred pages of stories. It's literally a couple hundred pages of stories that different patients have shared over the years. So there's a whole section on collagen stories, and I just wanted to report some of these stories. Now, you remember that collagen is the largest protein in our bodies, and you remember that collagen makes up all our organs, all our tissues. It makes up your bones, your ligaments, your joints. It even makes up your red blood cells and makes up your skin and your muscles, right? And as we age, collagen production falls way, way off, and this is the reason for ptosis, why our organs and our skin and our muscles tend to sag as we age, because the loss of collagen integrity within these structures. So then when you can add back on a daily basis a very bioavailable form of hydrolyzed collagen, tiny, tiny molecule, very usable, the body will triage. It will utilize this collagen supplementation in the areas that are most in need of it. And so we've seen some astounding, intriguing examples of this self-healing, holistic ability of the body. I'll just tell you a couple of these stories. There was a water skier who contacted me. He was a competition water skier up in Lake Tahoe, and he had this horrific accident in which the tow bar that he was holding on to, somehow he got out of balance, and the tow bar was whipped with very high velocity directly into his biceps, severing his biceps, and the biceps had to be surgically removed. They made a mistake, and they waited too long thinking it could heal, and it was borderline gangrene. It was a horrible story. But they removed his biceps, and he thought he would never be able to use the arm again, and he began to take large quantities of the hydrolyzed collagen every day, and after, he was in intractable pain, he told me. And after a few weeks, the pain went away, virtually all the pain went away completely, and he told me that after 3 months, due to collateral muscle development, he was actually able to water ski again, although without the biceps, no longer at the competition level. But that's a very interesting story that you might read if you're an athlete. I had another story of a chiropractor down in the Santa Barbara area. And this doctor, he was in his 70s, and he began to get weaker and weaker. His muscles began to, the muscles in his legs began to degenerate, and he was confined to a wheelchair. He had a lot of pain. He had a lot of pain in his arms and legs. And he began to take hydrolyzed collagen in high doses every single day. It's blended in fruit juice. You blend it in fruit juice every single day. And after a few weeks, he began to get up out of the wheelchair, and he graduated to a walker. And then after a few more weeks, he got rid of the walker in favor of a cane, 2 canes actually, and then gradually he got rid of the canes, and now he is able to walk, although still in a sort of a forward posture. Even the antalgic forward posture improved as the pain levels diminished. So, and this chiropractor, he surrounded himself with some of the best chiropractors in Southern California, so he knew the whole idea of getting adjusted, and that part of the program was taken care of. Believe me, he's a great chiropractor, and now he is able to adjust people again. But more than that, it's that he was completely debilitated in the wheelchair, and now he has much more normal and pain-free life. So please read that story in the feedback section as well. There was another patient that you can read the story of, and this patient had severe, intractable low back pain for 6 years. And this patient, she went to several chiropractors. It had limited success. She was getting worse and worse. She She took all kind of pain medications at the same time as she was getting adjusted. And she had never heard of hydrolyzed collagen. She began to take the high doses of it every day, and she found that she was able to walk straight with no pain in 5 days. So this is like one of these miracle cases. It just turned out that that was the missing component in her particular case. And this patient also said that 1 month later she was virtually out of pain completely. And this is after 6 years of daily intractable pain. There's another story that you can read of a patient who had severe hip pain that worsened over a 1-year period until finally he collapsed and tried everything, tried all kind of physical therapy. He tried pain drugs, tried chiropractic. Nothing helped him whatsoever until he discovered hydrolyzed collagen. After 2 months of daily use, his pain virtually went away, his normal life returned, and then with the help of chiropractic adjustments, he was able to run on the beach after another few weeks. So that's another notable story that you can read under the feedback section. There was another lumbar disc patient who had indescribable pain, constant pain, 24 hours a day. The normal Motrin 800s, these type of drugs, didn't touch his pain, so he was on the prescription meds, the prescription pain meds, and he told me that he was a drug addict. The disc situation became so severe that he began to have cachexia in the lower extremities, muscle wasting. At one point, his prescription meds bill was in the area of $1,000 per month. So he's spending $1,000 per month on pain meds. The orthopedic surgeons finally talked him into scheduling a lumbar fusion. Before he did the fusion, however, he discovered hydrolyzed collagen and began taking it daily, just like all these other patients. And soon after a few weeks, the pain became bearable. After a few more weeks, the pain vanished, and of course he canceled the lumbar surgery. And this is a story that I've just heard over and over again, canceling of joint replacement surgeries and disc surgeries. Another amazing case that you can read in this story section is a woman called me, an older lady, and she had a diffuse cancer that had spread throughout her body, and it was inoperable. It was everywhere within her bones, and they didn't want to do chemotherapy or radiation or any surgery because it was so advanced, and they just sent her home with pain medication. And again, the pain medications had virtually no effect on this poor woman's constant severe pain. It was beyond them. She discovered the hydrolyzed collagen, began taking it every single day in large quantities, and she reported to me, she called me up on the phone to tell me this, that her pain, all this indescribable bone pain, was gone within 2 weeks. So, you know, all these stories sound like some kind of midnight infomercial, but these are real people that these stories really happened, and these people really unsolicited, they reported these stories to me, and I'm just passing them on. Why does it work so well? Well, the hydrolyzed collagen works so well because of, first of all, because of the source. We use organic bovine sources. That's where collagen is derived from the skin of cattle that are raised in an organic way in a very clean and healthful environment. Also, we discovered about a decade ago that if we add trace amounts of 3 amino acids, which would be cysteine, glycine, and glutamine, that the bioavailability and the uptake at the cellular level would be significantly enhanced. That's the only other ingredients in the hydrolyzed collagen. It has no sweeteners, no preservatives, nothing else in it. It's just pure hydrolyzed collagen at a very small molecular level from a very clean source. I wanted to mention a couple ideas about thirst and hydration here that I sort of got skipped before. My teacher in this area, whom I never met, unfortunately, was Dr. Batman Jelage, and he was the famous guy who wrote the bestseller in the mid-90s entitled Your Body's Many Cries for Water. Remember that book? And then the book that he wrote before he died was called Water and Salt. And that's the book that I really recommend for people. It's really his masterpiece in my opinion. And it will explain to you the difference between thirst and hydration. And most people are not thirsty for 2 liters of water a day, but yet the majority of Americans are dehydrated. So we know that we drink a lot of soft drinks, we drink a lot of trashy pop energy drinks, coffee, this type of thing, anything but what we actually need, water. Water in the form of water. So one of the questions on the intake form when I do a bioterrain rate analysis and nutritional counseling is, how much water do you drink every day? And it's so amazing that most people write down 1 cup, not much, or 5 cups of coffee per day. That's their description of how much water they drink every day. So it's not controversial that most people are dehydrated. They admit it. They tell you that themselves. So the disease imbalances that they have, their indispositions, their physical ailments, pains, and problems, a lot of these are contributed to and sometimes directly caused by their dehydration. So what I'm saying here is you can't go from a condition of chronic dehydration back to normal hydration in one day. I always think of the picture of the guy who's dying of thirst in the desert, you know, with the beating sun and the desert and the rattlesnake in the background, and he's dying of thirst, and then somebody discovers him right at the last minute, and like in the movies, you know, they'll give him a canteen and he'll drink the water, and suddenly he'll be fine, you know, and he'll get up and fight a bunch of people and have a gunfight. Well, that doesn't happen like that. You can't rehydrate the body in a day or two. First of all, the cells aren't used to accepting this amount of water. They're so desiccated, the cell membranes are so dried out that they simply won't take in the water that you are suddenly offering it. So let's say in the average dehydrated patient who is going to begin the 60-day program and for the first time is going to attempt to drink 2 liters of water a day, usually they can't do it right off the bat. So they try and drink as much water as they can. And if they can drink 1 liter of water, up to 1 liter of water per day during the first week, well, that is real progress. And it's that the body, as I say, the desiccated cells who are used to being dehydrated, they just will not take in all this water. Then something happens when you keep on trying. It usually takes a couple of weeks. I've experienced this myself, and many patients have told me this who are on the 60-day program. Suddenly, some kind of osmotic switch is thrown within the body, and suddenly they are able to take in 2 liters of water per day. So they're drinking all the time, and then an amazing thing happens. Their mouth feels dry. Then they begin to feel thirsty, real thirst. And that's because finally the body is being hydrated and it is beginning to accept the water that is being offered to it. And this is where we are really correcting chronic long-term dehydration. So it's something that takes at least a couple weeks in order to begin to occur. This is a phenomenon that is explained very clearly in Batman-Gelic's final book, Water and Salt. There it is. There's a picture. 2003. Water and Salt by Dr. F. Batman-Gelic. He also talks about the myth of the salt-free diet. Some of these holistic cancer approaches are very fanatical about salt-free, and this is also what I call alternative light, or the medical approach to nutrition. So, so medical people who have 0 hours in nutrition in their education, suddenly they're going to come across as nutritional authorities. One of their mantras is, especially for the patient with high blood pressure, no salt, no salt. Like the salt in their diet was something that caused the hypertension in the first place. They never ask anything about the person's lifestyle, and if you do just a simple lifestyle analysis, you can see what really caused the hypertension, this intake of an enormous amount of oxidized fats, hydrogenated oils, all the things that contribute to atherosclerotic plaque. So Batman-Gelic talks about the importance of a daily intake of iodized sea salt and how important that is in the mineral balance. He talks about the sodium-potassium balance. I mean, if you're 100% salt-free, it's going to also throw off the potassium intake, which is another vital electrolyte that we need for many, many of our metabolic functions. So forget this myth. Anytime you hear about salt-free diet, they really don't know what they're talking about. This is the source to begin to understand that mechanism within the human body. Without a proper ratio and a proper balance of sodium and potassium pump going on within the body at all times, you have geometrically reduced ATP production within the mitochondria, which is necessary for virtually all metabolic processes and pathways. So yeah, the importance of iodized sea salt along with an adequate intake of potassium and magnesium in a usable form. And the best usable form for supplement minerals, of course, is the chelated form, and we talk about that in the mineral section. So that concludes section 7 here. Thank you very much for listening.